Good morning, Facebook friends and YouTube friends. We are going to get started in chapter 2 here in just a second. So a couple of things that I want to just mention before we get started this morning, and one is we've already had an interesting discussion about something that I don't have the answer to, but I'm going to look and see what I can find, because someone was mentioning about quotation marks in the chapters, which I just thought was really interesting. So if you pull out chapter 2, go ahead, and I'm just going to address this question and let you know that I'm going to do my best to, good morning, Karen, I hope you're feeling better. I'm going to just kind of address this question because I don't have an answer to it. But if you look at verse 15 in chapter 2, everybody see where I am, 120, page 122, and it starts with quotation marks. And then if you look at 17, verse 17 at the top of the next page, it starts with quotation marks. Good morning, Hope. But it never ends with, 16 doesn't end with quotation marks, even though 17 starts again.
20 and ends.
Yeah, and we were looking before class started in a couple of...
14.
It does it in the middle of 14.
Yeah, it does it several places. Yeah, I was just pointing out that one. But before class started, we were looking in a couple of different translations. And I've lost it completely. And different verses have different... where the quotation marks are. So anyway, I don't know why it's like that, but
everything that he said. If you look at 14, it said, I said to Cephas in the presence of all, and then the quote start. I was wondering if he said all of this
okay.
to Cephas.
Okay.
And then he's starting each thing is saying that he's still talking.
Okay.
It doesn't end until...
But 16
But
doesn't
why does it
have
start all over like
16
and
no,
20?
16 doesn't.
Yeah, but that starts with a little... But
It's not at the beginning of a sentence. Yeah.
It's not
Thanks, Laura.
Take a little English.
Anyway, I know. So I am going to, but the interesting thing was in different versions the quotation marks were in different versions the quotation marks were in different places. I know. Ding 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 ding. It's the joy of a live class. Good morning, Sue.
So
So
wonderful.
I said they didn't teach grammar and punctuation in Hebrew school.
no, they didn't. So I'm just gonna look and see if I can find either from.
You're following the law, you're going to follow.
I'm gonna. Okay. Either from a biblical reason or like an English grammar reason. I'm just going to see if I can find an answer, and I'll bring any answer that I can find, okay? And if anybody watching is an English person and you know the answer, you can tag me in it, and that'll help send me in the right direction. Anyway, I love questions like that. I really do, because I think it's just interesting, the things that we find when we study deep, and I'm not observant like that. I didn't even notice. So I think it's fun when we notice different things. So, okay, the other couple of announcements that I have, I put a couple of flyers around in your areas. There's 2 different flyers. One of them is, and for those of you watching, I'm going to post, good morning, Joyce. I'm going to post the links to the flyers in the comments, either on YouTube or on Facebook when I move the videos to the right place. But the first one is about my spring retreat. And I just want to let you guys know that registration is open. This is not any pressure for you to come, but I always just want to let you know when I'm doing something like that. And it is out at Little Grassy in McCanda. And I have different length of stay options. You can come days only. You can come stay one night. You can come stay both nights. And we're going to be doing my 5-step Bible study approach all weekend long. So you are welcome. Registration opened on Friday, and I'm about half full already, which is exciting. But it's exciting. But anyway, I have some space still, and I just wanted to share that I'm doing that with you all in case you might be interested. And then the other thing is the classes, the plan for the classes for the rest of the year. And if you already have one of those flyers, it has not changed. But if you don't have one or misplaced yours or whatever, that will tell you when this class ends, when Genesis starts, all those kind of things. So you are welcome to one so that you have all of that information. So, and again, if you're watching online, I will put those PDFs in the comments for you so that you can have them.
My Bible has a comment.
Your Bible has a comment on the quotation marks. Stop it. No way.
I love it.
I love it.
Some
Okay.
interpreters hold that the quotation extends into the following paragraph.
Okay.
And so we have these paragraphs.
Yes. Some
And there's-
interpreters say that the quotation extends into the following paragraph. Okay,
And
but
there
then
is-
that's why it would be different in some, because some don't see it that way. Yeah, okay.
There's quotations at that very, very, very
At the very end of 2.
Yeah, there is.
Well, and remember, like, even though 2 ends for us,
Yeah.
it wasn't like that. I mean, it was one
Yeah.
letter, so the divisions are for us.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm sure that gets tricky then. But good. Well, interesting. Well, that may be our answer. Some people think it is like this.
Just like,
But,
before you spend a whole lot
I
of
know,
time
right?
looking for it, I'm like,
Yeah. No, yes.
It's
So
different interpretation if you think that he said all of this
yes.
to Cephas.
Yes.
Rather
Yeah.
than just the first.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
sentence.
Yeah. Exactly.
We were in a writers club.
Yes.
And when we went to self-publish our
Yes.
collection, there was really, really weird grammar, punctuation things in the writing and publishing
Uh-huh.
that were different than like what we did in
Yes.
school. So I'm
Yes.
thinking this is
Uh-huh.
kind of that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of the reasons that it was interesting when I had my Bible study edited professionally. She taught me things about how you
Yeah.
write to be
Yeah.
published that were like just different than than to write however I write. Because most of the time it's interesting because most of the things that I write are things that I'm writing to speak. It's either a message or a teaching lesson or something, and to write something that people are, good morning, Donalyn, to write something that people are going to read, it's different, yeah. At least it was for me, or is for me, so. Okay, I think that's it by way of announcements, and come on in, ladies. And I will let them get settled just one second, and then I will open us up with a word of prayer. And then we'll dive into chapter 2. Holy Father, thank you so much for the opportunity to gather this morning, to dive into this chapter of Galatians, to learn what we've been learning, to talk about what we've been learning, and to learn more from each other and from you, Lord. And so I just pray that you will encourage us to come with an open posture, open arms and hands and heart and mind, that we might truly receive your instruction and your encouragement and your love, and that studying like this might further us in our devotion to you and in our trying to live our life in your example, God. So I'm grateful for this time and for these people who gather here and gather online now or later, just because I'm so grateful for their companionship as we study together. And we just we thank you for your kindness and for communicating to us through your word. And we lift all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Can I just
All
say,
right, you can say whatever.
I
Well, not
am
whatever,
so-
but
well, whatever. I am so thankful that you have this on Facebook.
I'm so glad.
Because it gave me, I mean, I just got real far behind.
Yeah.
And I didn't watch it
Yes.
on,
Right.
live.
Yeah.
But it gave me a chance to catch up with what I
Yes.
was doing
Thank you.
here and to listen to you guys.
Yes.
And it's been awesome.
I'm
It's an
so
awesome
glad.
thing.
Thank you
Yeah,
for
it's an
that
awesome
feedback.
thing.
Yeah. And for those of you, Mary Ellen has missed several from a surgery, but she's back with us today. And we're so excited to have her back and that you're doing well. And I am grateful for that. I get a lot of positive feedback about having the option for online. And a lot of it is from people who like don't live here or can't come for whatever reason, but a lot of it is from people who want to do it regularly, but some of y'all, then you're traveling a little bit or health, whatever, and so then you can not miss a whole class because you might have a few weeks that you're not going to miss or
Well,
something.
it's
So
wonderful
yeah,
that it's not just live, that
Uh-huh.
you
That
can
it'll-
call it up
yeah.
later on.
Yay. Mhm.
I would
Yeah.
get, because there were days that I wasn't up to doing
Right.
stuff, and so a couple days later I
Yes.
said, well, I think I'm going to do this now, and it was wonderful.
Thank
It
you.
was
I'm
really
so
wonderful.
glad. Don't tell anyone, Michelle, but I would really like to get something prettier on the wall back here because when you watch it online, it's just like blank white screen. But anyway, okay, but that's like down the road. Oh, Karen's watching. Don't tell your husband. No, I'm just kidding. Don't you think, Karen, this needs to be prettier? Okay. She's like, oh man, I got to sign out now. I won't do it in the middle of the night when no one's watching. So what I want to do is we did this last week and I really liked it. And so I want to just start this morning by reading chapter 2. Because, as I said last week, if you were here or watching, what happens to me sometimes is I get so into breaking it apart that every once in a while I lose track of the overall arc of the chapter that we're studying. And I've noticed that sometimes when even like when in class we get down into like sort of the nitty gritty of a certain thing, and then I feel like, wait a second, I think I've lost the main point of where we're going today a little bit, whatever. So one of the things that it's been helping me, Karen says yes, we have her vote. Good, okay, good. One of the things that helps me a lot is just, I've been starting to, when I prepare my lesson for like the day, I'm like, just read it all a couple of times, and remind yourself of kind of the overall arc. And so what I want to do today, and if you want to follow along in Galatians 2 from your workbook, that's fine, but I want to read it from the Message today, just because the Message gives us just a way different. So if you want to follow along, or if you want to just kind of soak it up and listen to Paul speak from the words in the Message paraphrase. And again, in case you're not familiar with the Message, a lot of if it's a translation, it goes back to the original language and writes it in English. This is a paraphrase, which means it went from English to English. So he's taking the English translation and then putting it in more modern English. So that's why we call it a paraphrase. So chapter 2 starts, what is central? 14 years after that visit, Barnabas and I went up to Jerusalem and took Titus with us. I went to clarify with them what had been revealed to me. At that time, I placed before them exactly what I was preaching to the non-Jews. I did this in private with the leaders, those held in esteem by the church, so that our concern would not become a controversial public issue marred by ethnic tensions, exposing my years of work to denigration and endangering my present ministry. Significantly, Titus, non-Jewish though he was not required to be circumcised. While we were in conference, we were infiltrated by spies pretending to be Christians. Isn't that strong? Spies pretending to be Christians who slipped in to find out just how free true Christians are. Their ulterior motive was to reduce us to their brand of servitude. We didn't give them the time of day. We were determined to preserve the truth of the message, capital M, for you. As for those who were considered important in the church, their reputation doesn't concern me. God isn't impressed with mere appearances, and neither am I. And of course, these leaders were able to add nothing to the message I had been preaching. It was soon evident that God had entrusted me with the same message to the non-Jews as Peter had been preaching to the Jews. Recognizing that my calling had been given by God, James, Peter, and John, the pillars of the church, shook hands with me and Barnabas, assigning us to a ministry to the non-Jews, while they continued to be responsible for reaching out to the Jews. The only additional thing they asked was that we remember the poor, and I was already eager to do that. If you're following along, are you doing okay? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. Later, when Peter came to Antioch, I had a face-to-face confrontation with him because he was clearly out of line. I know. Here's the situation. Earlier, before certain persons had come from James, Peter regularly ate with the non-Jews. But when that conservative group came from Jerusalem, he cautiously pulled back and put as much distance as he could manage between himself and his non-Jewish friends. Doesn't that sound just a little bit different to me? It did to me. That's how fearful he was. Interesting word choice, I thought. That's how fearful he was of the conservative Jewish clique that's been pushing the old system of circumcision. Unfortunately, the rest of the Jews in the Antioch church joined in on that hypocrisy so that even Barnabas was swept along in the charade. But when I saw that they were not maintaining a steady, straight course according to the message, capital M, I spoke up to Peter in front of them all. If you, a Jew, live like a non-Jew when you're not being observed by the watchdogs from Jerusalem, what right do you have to require non-Jews to conform to Jewish customs just to make a favorable impression on your old Jerusalem cronies? I know. We Jews know that we have no advantage of birth over non-Jewish sinners. We know very well that we are not set right with God by rule keeping, but only through personal faith in Jesus Christ. How do we know? We tried it. And we had the best system of rules the world has ever seen. We had the best system of rules the world has ever seen. Convinced that no human being can please God by self-improvement, we believed in Jesus as the Messiah so that we might be set right before God by trusting in the Messiah, not by trying to be good. Have some of you noticed that we are not yet perfect? No great surprise, right? And are you ready to make the accusation that since people like me who go through Christ in order to get things right with God aren't perfectly virtuous, Christ must therefore be an accessory to sin? The accusation is frivolous. If I was trying to be good, I would be rebuilding the same old barn that I tore down. I would be acting as a charlatan. I had to look that up like a con artist. I'm sure you all know. I'm like, I think I know what that means, but it's like a con artist. What actually took place is this. I tried keeping rules and working my head off to please God, and it didn't work. So I quit being a lawman so that I could be God's man. Christ's life.
That's a good.
I know. So I know. I quit being a quote lawman so that I could be God's man. Christ's life showed me how and enabled me to do it. I identified myself completely with him. Indeed, I have been crucified with Christ. My ego is no longer central. It is no longer important that I appear righteous before you or have your good opinion, and I am no longer driven to impress God. That was big for me too. I am no longer driven to impress God. Like it's a comparison thing. Christ lives in me. The life you see me living is not mine, but it is lived by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I am not going to go back on that. Is it not clear to you that to go back to that old rule-keeping, peer-pleasing religion would be an abandonment of everything personal and free in my relationship with God? I refuse to do that, to repudiate God's grace. If a living relationship with God could come only by rule-keeping, then Christ died unnecessarily. So I know that was a little bit lengthy, but I hope that it serves us well, kind of, though, as we...
This is had one time that wasn't anything like
This was the message. This is the message. Yeah. And I just thought... Yeah. I thought that it might just be kind of like a fresh, look at kind of what we're doing. It's all like that. Eugene Peterson is the man's name who did that Bible. Yeah, it's called The Message. I love it. Yeah, you can get it on your phone through apps and whatever. So
Sometimes our pastors quote
yes,
the message.
yeah, it's a wonderful study tool. Go ahead.
Teachers coming out there, what are the quotes in that one?
Wait, you know what? My Message Bible for me is kind of old, and it doesn't have numbers in it. So I can look, I can figure it out, but it would take me a minute. So yeah, we could do it. Yeah, I'll look though and figure it out.
You would put quotes at the beginning of the paragraph.
Yeah.
Probably all of this.
Yes.
This one was spoken to
has verses.
Yes.
And
Sure.
they may be-
Yeah, the Message Bible, if you do use it very much, some of like the older ones don't have any verse numbers at all. Like that's the way mine is. And most of them have a lot of them have like, but at the beginning of a paragraph it'll say like 18 to 21 or something because it's like a paraphrase. It doesn't flow necessarily the same where so it's a little bit, but it's a great study aid, especially when you're like, what does that sound like in a more English, I don't know, in a more common English, of course there's actually CEB is Common English Bible, but this is even more just kind of, I don't know, sometimes the things are like, whoo, that's straight talk, yeah. So anyways, okay, I wanted to do that, and then let's just do a really quick review on what we've learned so far. Look at chapter 1 real quick before we get into chapter 2, just so we can remind ourselves of where we are. What did we learn in chapter 1 about about the Galatian churches and Paul? What's the relationship there between Paul and the Galatian church? Why is he writing to them?
He was there a long time ago.
He was there previously, started those churches.
And he stayed a long time.
Stayed, yes.
Years before he went to Jerusalem.
He stayed there, is that what it said, that he stayed there 14 years? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It said after 14 years he went to Jerusalem.
Yes, okay, yes. And so they had received the message, the gospel message, and believed in faith. At least some people did, right? And then what word does he use in verse 6 on chapter 1, verse 6? That what's happening now? Amazed. I am amazed. And we looked that up a couple of different places, and it was like shocked, like amazed in a bad way. And the central problem that he's struggling with, what are they doing?
Going back to the law.
They are wanting circumcision.
Yes, they're going back to rule keeping. Yes, people have come in, he calls them those who are disturbing you. People have come in kind of behind Paul, and they've done a couple of things. They have personally attacked Paul on what are they like accusing him of or declaring? That he's that he's not telling them the whole truth, that it can't be just based on faith, it has to be on law. And how do they try to discredit Paul personally? Yes, in chapter 1.
An apostle.
Right, yes, right. So they're saying, listen, this guy isn't even an apostle, and he's leading you wrong, that you do have to be circumcised, you do have to follow the law. It's about that too. And so Paul, in whatever level they are accepting this, and then, I'm buying it, whatever, he is so amazed, yes, disturbed. He's very upset. And I think we talked about this. I think from the tone of he's mostly upset that they're denying the grace of Jesus, like they're not living in that. But I think we have to know that it's probably quite hurt also, that now that I'm not there, it's easy for you to forget our relationship and how we had this fellowship together, and how I shared the Spirit and you received the Spirit, and now you're saying that doesn't matter, and he's very upset about that. This is the letter that he wrote the Galatian churches, yes. Okay, so anything else on chapter 1, just as a review, before we jump into chapter 2? Chapter 2, if you want to put it on your, we did, when we did the overview, we listed all the chapter themes, but I don't want to assume that all that's filled out for you. So if you want to put in the chapter theme, this is the at a glance that we like to keep our chapter themes on. It's on page 139 in your lesson. And we kind of decided together, although this doesn't have to be your chapter theme, but that following the law over Christ nullifies God's grace. Following law over Christ nullifies God's grace. So that's kind of there's a lot going on in this chapter, as we just read, but following law over Christ nullifies God's grace. And I might even, even just looking at it now, I might even adjust it slightly and say, trusting in law over faith nullifies God's grace. Something like that is the overall theme for that chapter. Anybody have something different for the chapter that you just want to put out there that you thought strengthens that or adds to it, or no? Okay, so then when we look in, we just kind of get started. Let's see where the chapter, there's a map on page 141 in your book, if you want to find a couple of places, because this chapter starts about like some journeys, and at the end of chapter 1, everybody finding the map? At the end of chapter 1:17, what does he say happened first? Yes, he went to Arabia. You don't have to look at your map if you don't want to, but it kind of helps put it in perspective, I think. And then 141 is the map. I'll pull this out. So the map looks like this in your book, 141. And so so he started in, I put these little numbers in. So he started in Arabia, which is like down here. Can you guys see that on your map, I guess? And then where did he go? 1:18, he says. He went to...
Well, first he went to Damascus.
Oh, Damascus, yes, which is just right above that. I put a little 2 there. And then he went to Jerusalem, which is like right over here. And then he went where? 121, Syria is over here above Damascus. You see back where we are there. And then Cilicia, I think that's maybe how you say that, is a little bit farther up, right about here. And then 14 years later, chapter 2, verse 1. See how it's like 1 just kind of goes into 2, and then 14. Then after an interval of 14 years, he went back to Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. Because of why? Verse 2.
He went to
What did you say?
didn't say he had a vision?
Yes, a revelation. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So he because of a revelation, he went back to Jerusalem. And who did he take with him? Yes, Barnabas and Titus. And they went in private. Right. We talked about that in when we just were reading from the message. And who did he go to see in private?
Peter, James, and John.
Peter, James, and John. And why Peter, James, and John? Pillars of the church. Yeah. Yeah.
James was really the leader of.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So just to clear up, so James is, yes, the leader of the Jerusalem church, the half brother of Jesus, who, incidentally, we've learned, maybe you've learned, that didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah until after the resurrection. Jesus appeared to him. Yeah. And then Peter and John are Peter and John the disciples, Peter and John. And what did Paul want to talk to them about? He had a revelation, he sought them out, he met with them in private, because why?
He didn't want to create a big problem before there maybe wasn't a problem.
Yes, the why of meeting, that's the why of meeting them in private, yes. Because I'm hoping to not, I can't remember what it said in the message, but it
was
create,
good.
it was good, yeah.
Stirring up
Yes, it was, I'm trying not to stir up a bunch of trouble, maybe. Although I don't know that Paul was really scared of trouble.
I think he was.
I don't, but it's kind of funny. There's a thing in the Barclay commentary. It will take me 1 second to find it, but it won't take me very long. This was really important to me because as we wrestle with church rules or church legalism or things that were like, wait a second, there were two things that Barclay said about Paul, and he says from this picture, what we're just talking about, going in private and all that, there were certain characteristics of Paul that clearly emerge. And the first one was he was a man who gave authority its due respect. And I thought that's important, right? He gave authority its due respect. And he says nothing is to be gained by rudeness. So he goes to them, right? He has this revelation, and I'm going to you. You are the leaders of the church, and I'm meeting with you. I'm not trying to stir up trouble. Like, here's the thing, because what he leaves with is like a handshake, right? Like we agree to do this. So he goes in peace, in peaceful, giving authority its due respect, not being rude. That's number one that Barclay that wrote about. And then the second thing is he was a man who refused to be intimidated. And so he says on that he respected them and he treated them with courtesy, but he remained inflexible. So it's interesting because Barclay's like take on that this is how things are done, and so I'm going to try to do things the way things are done, but I'm going to preach to the Gentiles, and so I hope this goes well. Sort of is what, and I will treat you with courtesy and respect. And I come kind of seeking your blessing on this. Oh, and 3, it says he was a man conscious of a special task. He would neither let opposition from without nor discouragement from within stop him from doing it. And I think that's really interesting that those are the things. So he gave authority its due respect, he refused to be intimidated, and he was conscious of a special task. So he has this like resolute, I set my face towards this goal that God has called me towards, and I'm confident in my calling, and I am going to do it. But I'm also recognizing that there are some obstacles along the way, and how I handle them is an important part of my witness also. Because we can get so determined in our task that we steamroll over other people, and then it minimizes our message, right? It minimizes our witness, and Paul wasn't trying to do that. Go ahead, Sherry. Yeah.
I think it's important that they said he didn't do it in front of other people. He did it in a small group.
Yeah.
Because he was confronting them and he was saving their face, face, so they wouldn't appear angry or stupid or argumenting in front of a group of people, which would cause division.
Because in general, if you have kind of like maybe a potential problem between people, isn't it most of the time better if you can sit across table from each other and look at each other and speak calmly rather than like calling out their defensive-ness, right? Because I think in it handled differently, you would have kind of like gotten their back up or whatever, and they're like, hey, no, we're taking a stand too, and so,
it's kind of like when you're running a business and you have an employee that you need to correct or coach. You don't do that in front of everybody else.
You really shouldn't, right? Yeah, that's not going to build trust. Yeah, that's not going to build trust. I try to do that even in my parenting. because I mean my kids are a little bit older now, but I tried very hard whenever I needed to correct them to not let any embarrassment that I felt dictate my response to them in the moment, because that can that can tear them down so much when your embarrassment because of their behavior then it like sort of like needs to be released and you'll make them embarrassed or whatever, then you're not building that trust relationship, right? And so I think that even though different situation, I think even if they had disagreed, which they did on some levels, and obviously a little bit farther in the chapter, Paul and Peter are going to have some words, right? But I think there's this appreciation or this trust building that happens when you come respectfully to someone and say, I want to talk to you about something that I think might be hard,
To me, this is a good guide.
Yes.
When there is divisions that are probably going to be coming up.
Oh my goodness, Kathy, I think that's an excellent point. How much division might be halted, aborted, if people were willing to calmly sit across the table from each other
You're not supposed to
and
compromise
discuss.
the message, and he never did that.
He never did. He firmly understood what God had called him to
But
do,
you
and he
do it
didn't compromise. But
respectfully.
yes,
Yes.
and he certainly took his first method was not attack. His first method was seek not even compromise, but seek like unity. Really, can we all agree that even though at the end they're going to do it differently, but they still they stay together in it. So
when you think about, he went to them and in private and with great thought ahead of time. I mean, and he may have. You think about this, he may have left that face-to-face conversation thinking that he had made his point. And just think what he went through then when they went to the dinner, if you would.
Yeah.
And Peter gets up and moves. And, I mean, think how he could have just had a complete come apart there.
Yes.
I mean, he kind of
Yeah.
Well, he kind of did it,
Yeah.
you're right,
Yeah.
but he did it.
Yeah.
He did it without, well, he made his point.
Yes. Yes.
But I'm sure that was really a downer for him, to come out of that meeting with them in private thinking that probably maybe he was solving the problem.
Yeah.
And then realized that it went through.
Well, and I go back to verse 2 that says, and I'm interested if you guys have different versions, I'd be curious what else this says. But in verse 2 it says, it was because of a revelation that I went up. So Paul's motivation, I think, isn't coming from Paul, right? Like I feel like God has sent me to Jerusalem to have this conversation, and therefore, if we can, when God calls us to something, then we're responsible for the obedience, and God is responsible for the outcome. Yeah, right, exactly. So what else? Anybody's version have a different word than revelation? Verse 2, it was because of a revelation. No, I don't remember what the message said.
Yeah, that
in different way.
Passage struck me in a different way.
Tell me.
Because when he said, "For fear that I might be running or have been in vain," and I took it, and just now I'm looking back to the chapter 117 where he says after his conversion he didn't immediately go to Jerusalem.
Right.
He went off to Arabia, and I think he just had probably I'm guessing had a long time of letting God
processing his
tear
own
him
experience
down and then rebuild him
Yes.
as the man he wanted him to be.
Yes.
And he finally is going to Jerusalem to see if his
message
what he's
is
been
right.
teaching is.
I'm curious.
In Acts, though, I believe it was, is where it says after his conversion, he went to Jerusalem to pray in the temple. And then God told him, gave him a revelation to get out of there. So he did. It was in Acts, I think.
Acts and this, I flipped back and forth because I thought, now wait a minute. Peter, what's Peter doing here? He got that sheet with all the animals. What is going? So I read the whole thing over.
Oh, in Acts 10 with Cornelius.
But that came first, right? That
Acts,
came
That
before
was after
he
Paul
did
was on the
this. He was already, he had already had that,
Oh,
done
Peter.
what he,
Oh, yeah.
done what he was
because he'd
supposed
gone
to do,
to,
and then all of a sudden
Yes.
he's back.
yes.
Yeah.
Back like.
And here, okay, I've got a couple of things in my mind that I want to unpack. A couple of them. I'm going to get back to what you were saying, Laura, in just a second. What you're saying is, and one of the things that I wrote in my notes today is, what is this? What do we learn more about Peter that can be a warning to us in that? Okay, do you know what? When I get there, then you guys will have to be like, we did this already. But like, so what Joyce is talking about in Acts 10. Peter has a vision, if you remember. He goes up on a roof and all the animals come down, like a sheet comes down and all these animals come down. And immediately after that, and the Lord is like, what I have, I won't say it right, what I have sort of ordained is not unclean, right? Okay, so and Peter's a little bit like, what? And then right away, there's someone comes for Peter because a Gentile named Cornelius and his household want to know about Jesus. And God is saying, go to the Gentiles. And this is hugely radical because the Jewish people did not socialize, do business with, nothing. And even when Peter shows up,
Go in their home and eat.
yes, they didn't go in their homes. And even when Peter shows up, one of the first things he says is, I'm not supposed to be here. Like that, right? Yeah. So, but then what happens is he preaches to them and they receive, they believe, and the Holy Spirit falls on them, those Gentiles, the same way that it had fallen on the Jews in Acts 2 earlier. Okay? And so Peter has this understanding then that God is doing something new or different than we have seen him do before, than we have witnessed, right? So so all of that has already happened to Peter's hugely personal experience. Firsthand, I saw God do this, and then yet here in Galatians where he's going to have this, we'll get to that in just a second, but this interaction with Paul, maybe we'll just camp on that. What does that tell us about Peter?
It's showing his
warn.
same personality.
Mm-hmm.
He denied Jesus 3 times.
Yes.
That
Right
is
after
true.
the
That is
Yes.
true.
crucifixion.
He wasn't
Yes.
So it's a personality trait that
Yes.
when things get a little
Yes.
touchy,
Yes.
I'm going to flee.
And what is that when things get touchy? And I will say, like, okay, and for all Peter's faults that we talk about, I will say he's the one that got out of the boat. He's the one that followed closely he was closer, from what we know, to Jesus during that trial and all that than anybody else was. He's the one that said, I will die with you, Lord. He's the one, right, that cut off the ear. That was Peter, right? That cut off. Okay, so he, for all his, but what does it say that he still was struggling with that Paul writes against in Galatians? Who am I working to please? Right?
Exactly.
Right. And I think that's a warning for all of us because, depending on our temperament and all that, Paul seemingly has overcome that, but Peter still struggles with it in that, when the chips are down and people are in my face not happy with my decision, I will compromise it sometimes. And let that be a warning to us, right?
In enduring that
Enduring word.
enduring what is
Yes,
it?
enduring word.
They
Yeah.
said, I read something in there yesterday that was very interesting. That one of the authors said, he probably was also fearful that if Peter could fall into that, so could he.
Paul.
That Paul maybe could do that, and he said, and although he had faith beyond any faith, they said that if I'll look it up.
Yeah, that's fine.
Read
I think
but
that
it was kind of interesting because I always think of Paul's faith as being.
I think Paul was very aware that it's a slippery slope.
Things could happen.
Yes, that it's
You
a
could
slippery
slide
slope.
down in
Yeah,
the muck.
I'm going to catch up on a couple of Facebook things. Good morning, Corey. I want to say that. And also, Hope has a comment, which I think is easy. It's good because she says it's easy, even for leaders, to slip back into old patterns. And Peter has a history of being a little flighty, right? And so, we're just people. But I think there's this definitely strong warning in Peter's personality that just reminds us, in those moments when people are a little bit I don't think that your behavior should look like this. Will we adopt that yoke of slavery that we keep talking about? Or will we stay and choose freedom? And
Really quick on.
Then I want to get back to what Laura was saying.
Revelation, the word Revelation.
Oh yeah, Revelation. I forgot I'd even asked that.
I went there because God revealed to me that I should go.
Right. Yes.
So same thing.
Yes.
As Revelation,
Right. But I think that's stronger in a way.
Yeah.
Because it's like I went not because I wanted to, maybe not because it was my idea, maybe, but I really felt like God was calling me to go. So the thing that Laura was saying is in verse 2, where it talks about at the end of verse 2, and this is Paul talking, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. And so let me read it again from the Message, and I think I have the right because there's no numbers. So this says, I did this in private with the leaders, those held in esteem by the church, we were just talking about that, so that our concern would not become a controversial public issue, marred by ethnic tensions, exposing my years of work to denigration and endangering my present ministry. So that's like the running in vain, like endangering my present ministry, I think. So I think I'm curious if you guys have study notes on 2:2 at all. I think he's saying that all of this preaching and encouraging people that it's all about faith and not about law, and some of the things that I'm doing might be in vain if the church just overthrows that. Like if the church won't agree or won't bless the fact that my message to Gentiles is different than how the Jewish people are living, then everything I'm doing is like useless. That's what I don't know. But you were saying that maybe like internally though, maybe his like what he was believing in was in vain. That's how you thought maybe it was. Is that I don't want to state what you were saying wrong. I don't know. It's fine. If I don't want to put you on the spot.
I don't know.
Yeah. That's fine. I know. That's fine. When you think about it a minute, then you can be like, no, wait a second. I think this. We can come back to it. It's no problem. Go ahead, Helen.
If Paul needed the endorsement of the leaders in Jerusalem, he would have met with them publicly. That they met privately indicates that no one thought he needed public endorsement.
So this is an issue between men, human. I mean, in this case they were men, but this is an issue between men in that we know what you're doing and we agree with what you're doing, and so those who would speak against you, we do not condone that. Like, does that make sense? Like, we're not going to send these people.
Paul's tone downplays their importance. Perhaps the counteract the false teachers' undue regard for them, so that these false teachers were coming with like, look at these, and putting him down. But he was trying to kind of.
So the false teachers maybe were like raising up the Jewish leaders, these people of reputation, and putting down Paul. But what Paul was like maybe seeking, or what God was seeking for Paul, was actually that those people of reputation in the church actually endorsed what Paul was doing.
And then it goes on to say, but he didn't. Paul shared the message with the apostles in Jerusalem, not for endorsement, but to ensure agreement, so that the church would not be split into Jewish and Gentile factions.
That was a big threat right there. So early in the church, right, where you're going to suddenly have the Jewish Christian church, even though it wasn't called that at the time, and the Gentile Christian church. And I think all of these men were wise enough in God's grace and the unity of the transformation power of Jesus Christ that they didn't want that. They wanted to be able to love him together. Go ahead, Sherry.
I think sometimes when I think of Peter and these his trying to avoid turmoil, he was a people pleaser. He was trying to make these two groups get along, but Peter was more present day church, and I think Paul's a visionary because he wrote all this. We're reading all this like 2,000 years later, so I think Paul was really trying to protect and warn us about things in the future that could divide a church.
Right.
So he was looking way ahead, not just then.
Yes.
And I think Peter is more
living in the moment.
Yeah. And
nuts
Peter,
and bolts.
Even though Peter had lived and walked with Jesus, Peter had a different kind of experience with Jesus than Paul did, right? Peter, I would say, this is like just a hypothesis that's popping into my mind right now. Peter had this like slow, although it probably like in 3 years didn't feel slow at all, and it was radical, don't get me wrong, but there was this like understanding of who Jesus was that came. Is he the Messiah? Is he not the Messiah? I saw this happen. I don't know. Now people are yelling at us. I wish you'd just keep peace. So, like this whole thing that unfolded in Peter's life. And Paul was like, bam.
Yeah.
You were this, now you're this. It's done.
His
Like,
personality.
and that, yes.
Even
and
when he was persecuting the church, he did it with a vengeance.
Paul's personality is very intense, but you think you do have these two men, different personalities, and also really different experiences of Jesus.
The risen Christ appeared to him.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Have to be more dramatic than
Yes. Well, and he experienced the transfiguration, and he walked on water. I mean, it's not like he didn't have experiences with Jesus. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it was like this sort of unfolding, maybe in a different way than Paul, who didn't experience him pre-resurrection. Like, so
it's a radical change.
Yeah.
Didn't comment here that said a split between Jewish and Gentile Christians would undermine the fundamental unity that Christ had secured.
Exactly.
Yes.
And I think maybe Peter still said, okay, they can have it.
Yes.
But we're still going to be separate.
Yes.
Kind of like segregation, but
and
they can have a good school, but we're going to have one too.
Right. And God went to great lengths to show Peter, even after Jesus was resurrection and ascension, he went to great lengths, what we're just talking about with the animals and the Cornelius and all that stuff, to say, I know how you lived was this way. I really have done something radically different to change this, and it's okay. But still, it would be, just think for any of you, if anyone's had this experience, and I think that I'm right that a few of you had, where you were like taught that this is the right way to do things, like in the church or with Jesus or for God or something, and you begin to feel a pull that, wait a second, something about what I've been taught doesn't feel like it's honoring to God, or it doesn't feel like this is how God would have me behave anymore or something. That's hard. It's hard to trust that. And then when you go back home for Thanksgiving and everyone else is doing it the old way, that doesn't feel good, right? Yeah, so that's really challenging. I remember I have a friend who grew up I can't remember how she grew up. It's a very strict religion, kind of very like oppressive almost. But she's always like walked with Jesus, but then we were attending church together for a while. And the first time I preached a sermon at the church that I was appointed to, she came to listen because she'd been told all her life, women do not preach, like it's just wrong. But she'd been in my Sunday school class for years. We'd been friends. She had watched me kind of walked through this process, and then I was appointed at this church, and she came that first Sunday because she was like, I have always been taught this. I have always believed it. But I know you, and I love you, and I see God in this, and I just need to sit here and like watch what happens. Like she was really, and I really respected that because she was like, it was radical for her to think, but I know you, and I believe you, but this isn't supposed to happen this way, right? And we wrestle with those things. Absolutely, you can. Yes, all of that is true. Yeah. So so you think about that, but even like in her situation. This isn't what happened, but when she goes back to, because so much of her family and friends are still like in that, she's the first thing she's going to say is like, hey, I want to talk about my friend Angie and what she's doing, right? Like, it's probably not going to be the first thing that comes up because they're going to be like, what, So
just wrong.
I know. So let's go find Angie. Anyway, just I respect the tension that he's dealing with. So. I think we're up to verse 3. So the people in Jerusalem, they agreed with Paul and his ministry to the degree that Titus was not compelled to be circumcised. We see that, right? And they gave Barnabas and Paul the right hand of fellowship. We looked up something on that page 37 in your homework. Let's look there real quick and see. I made a note to go to 37, so let's see if we can figure out why I said that.
What page is that?
37. I think we talked about the right hand of fellowship. And what that was. Oh yes, look at all. Oh, I have lots of highlighted notes that I wanted to get to on that thing. So, given the right hand, I wanted to just share a couple of things. Given right hand of fellowship to show that Paul would work with the Gentiles and they would work with the Jews. You see that part where he, what
Where
verse?
are you at, on 37?
Page 37.
I'm not seeing that.
B. Why did he go? That's what you learned. I'm about halfway down. But what does it say? what verse is it that says I'm going to do the Gentiles and they're going to do the Jews? 9? Oh, I got to turn it over. That's why I can't find it. There we go. Yes. 9, at the bottom of 9, me and Barnabas, the right hand of fellowship. You guys see where I am? Yeah. So that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised, which is the Jews. Okay? So Paul would work with Gentiles, and they, the church, the people he was talking to, would work with Jews. And there was a friendly handshake, or they shook hands. They were accepted as co-workers. I just looked up some other things. And this Greek word is koinonia, which means partnership, participation, communion. And I wrote this down in my notes. I thought they let him go where they weren't going. Mm-hmm. Like and I think probably they let him go where they didn't want to go. Yeah. And so I think they were a little bit like, that's the right gospel message. Like your message about life, death, resurrection, this is good. And we got to know what happened to Peter. We remember that, I think, right? And so, yeah, if you want to take that message to the people that we don't really associate with much, whatever, then we kind of give you our blessing to do that. So thought that was interesting. And let's look up, in verse 4, that's when the false brethren, they were trying to bring them into bondage. And what's the bondage that they're talking about in verse 4? Circumcision and law, right, yeah. And then let's talk about in Genesis. We looked at Genesis and we looked up a couple things about why it was so important for the Jews to be circumcised. Page 38.
It was an old covenant between Abraham.
Yes,
and God.
Yeah, it goes all the way back to Abraham.
Something that's very interesting about false brethren. That in that time, that was a very, very severe title to give someone.
Oh, false brethren.
It was not just they're preaching the wrong thing type of thing. That was a very emphatic title. They evidently, what I thought, these are just people but I guess the Judicizer thing is what it is. But this was really, they went into a lot of detail in this one commentary about, that was really a title that you didn't want.
Yeah.
At all.
Well, I hope that I would be good and consider the source, but I can't imagine anything cutting me more than someone accusing me of being a false teacher.
Oh, I know.
I mean, like really, not because I think everything I say is absolutely accurate. I mean, obviously sometimes I'm like, how do we think about that? Whatever. But to indicate that my heart's motivation was to deceive. I mean, that's what really, that would hurt me so much. And I think, anyone who really has a motivation to just hopefully share and create space where we can share and learn, and to be labeled with that is, it's very severe. So circumcision was the sign of the covenant. Every male at 8 days old was circumcised. I just preached on Genesis 17 Sunday, actually, which is so interesting. And Alex was here doing his message, and he said before he left, he's like, "Mom, I really hate it that I'm going to miss your sermon on circumcision." I'm like, "Yeah, I bet you are, baby." I know. But it was interesting. At 8 days old, I looked it up some commentators suggested that 8 days. It's more about health than about because the immune system kind of had kicked in by then, and the blood clotting had kicked in by then. So that's why they picked 8 days.
And
I don't know. I just read that.
Anyone that came into the household, so it might be adults.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Guess what?
Yeah. Right. So interesting. But and then so we looked that stuff up, and then we looked up some things in Acts 15. For those of you who have studied Acts, either with me or elsewhere, I always call Acts 15 the circumcision decision, because that is when the church, these people kind of got together, and they had to, it called the question of, do people have to be Jewish before they can be Christian? And that's when the church said, no, they don't. No, they don't. And James, if you remember, sent a letter and said that there were a couple of things that he wanted them to continue to do, and those kind of seem a little bizarre to us, but when you unpack those a little bit, those instructions were really more about, these are some things that the Jewish people are just not going to be able to get over,
It's like negotiating a contract.
So I'm going to encourage you to continue. One of them was about something they ate, and something was sexual morality, I think. I can't remember. Then they seemed a little bit strange, but he just was like, these are going to be the deal breakers for the Jewish people. So if you can kind of behave this way, then we're going to let everything kind of else go, and we're going to trust in that the grace of Jesus will be what works in you to make you right with him. So I did for a timeline. I don't want to. I looked up. I always am trying to get the time on these things straight, because we decided this letter was written somewhere. Galatians letter was written between 48 and 52 AD. So Acts 10, if I've done this right, anybody can check me, but I think I'm right. Acts 10, when Peter had the vision and he went to Cornelius that we were talking about, that was in around 39 AD. And the circumcision decision was in around 49 AD. And I remember this actually from the intro lesson, depending on whether this letter was written to the North Galatians or the South Galatians, it could have been just before or just after the circumcision decision in Acts 15. Yeah, so I'll tell you again. I'll do them in order. So Acts 10, the sheet and the animals and the issue with the Holy Spirit coming to the Gentiles was around 39 AD. Acts 15, the circumcision decision was around 49 AD. And this book was written somewhere between 48 and 52 AD. And the ascension, if you want to go up a little bit, would have been around 30 AD. Like, so Jesus' ascension would have been around 30 AD. I've looked those things up several times, and like every time I have to write them down again, because the timeline gets confusing to me. So I will, so you're welcome to, if you read something different, I want to know about it, because that's the best that I've put together in terms of, that helps me sometimes to know where people are. But because we're not sure, I think it matters in this book a little. Well, I guess it doesn't terribly, but like, I think it's important to know that they're not sure if this was right before or right after that big decision in Acts 15. So. Okay, let's see. We talked about fourth and the stuff in the Acts. I know, I'm not getting there. James's solution to the Jewish believers who wanted to require that the saved Gentiles be circumcised and keep the law was not to add to that burden. The Jews hadn't been able to keep the law. Remember, Paul says that. It's like, we haven't been able to do it, right? So, and then, okay, then let's talk about we're going to go into like 11 to 14. We're going to do like the Peter story, okay? And some of this we talked about because I got a little ahead of myself, but that's okay. So in verse 11, everybody see where I am again? I'm back in Galatians 2, verse 11, where Peter is in Antioch, right? And what's the situation?
He was slipping into eating with the Jews when there were certain men around that were leaders that he wanted to impress.
Yes. And Barclay talked about how the early churches would have an agape feast or a love feast. Did anybody else read about this in some of your commentary?
Andrew had some about that.
Okay, all right. I don't think it was in the Precept stuff. I think it was other stuff I read. So like maybe once a weekish or so, people would combine resources and have a large meal together. And Barclay talked specifically about how for like some of the slaves that were part of the church, it might have been like the best meal that they had all week, right? But they just pooled resources or whatever, and they had this meal together. And it had been Peter's custom or Peter's habit to participate in the love feast with everyone in the church. But when the Jewish people, the cronies, is that what the message called them? When the Jewish cronies came on the scene, then Peter stopped coming to the love feast or to the agape feast is what Barclay was suggesting. And I thought, okay, that gives us a different, like, think about our potlucks, okay? Every good church has potlucks. And so think about our potlucks. If there was someone who had kind of come like from a different understanding, and someone in leadership, all right, let's see if we can put this like in our own. So we're having these regular potlucks, and there's a person from like whatever, conference or the bishop or something, I don't know, somebody like that comes and participates in them all the time. Even though we let people come, let's say, who haven't been members or baptized. I'm just making something up, right? So people come off the streets or whatever, like, there's whatever. But the bishop comes all the time and eats these dinners with us. But then some other bishops come into town to visit, and he won't step foot he or she won't step foot in there, you know, like, oh, I'm not doing it while they're here, kind of thing. And so Paul's like, you hypocrite, you've been eating this food every time we go to the barbecue every week, and you've been eating it and loving it, and now that your cronies are here from whatever, you don't want them to see you doing that, right? Which is kind of the situation, I think. Forgive the example, which is kind of bad, but you get the point, I think, you know, which is kind of the example, like, you're our friend, and you're their friend, and you've been eating here, and you know that they're fine, maybe even, like, not baptized, or just, like, not status people, or, you know, whatever, something about it. When other people came in, he decided it would be safer, that's the key, right? It would be safer for me not to participate while they're here than to take a stand against something I know they won't approve of. So that's kind of the issue that Paul is confronting Peter about. And one of the big problems for Paul wasn't just Peter, but it was what else? 13, verse 13. Barnabas. Yeah. And I think he's kind of like, and now you've drugged my kid into it, which is not his kid, but, you know, like that kind of, you know, that kind of, now you've convinced others that are close to me and know better, because Peter was like, you know, a bishop. I don't want to even use that term, but he was like, what you do, people are watching what you do, and now they're worried that maybe they've been doing it wrong or whatever. Yeah. Go ahead, Thelma.
I'll remember the name of the commentary that I checked out of the church library.
Good for you, yay!
But anyway, it said that again, Paul was so intent on this being one church, rather than a Jewish church and the other.
Yes.
And he said, you know, for the Jews, following the law, it was not always easy to judge whether or not people were following the law, except circumcision. So you couldn't really know.
There were too many of them.
You could honor the Sabbath or not. But you could know that they were circumcised.
And what they ate, I would think, you know, because there were such,
that the table fellowship was another way of saying we belong and you don't.
Yes, because the dietary restrictions were such that it was obvious if you ate this, you weren't doing it, or if you ate with these people, you weren't.
Separate the Jewish Christian church. And Paul was so intent on this being one family and not.
Yes.
You know, it's kind of like in our own history when you had separate but equal schools.
Yes. Yeah. Let's think about our potluck example just a little further with that, because Thelma, I think you're helping me like solidify what this. So we have barbecue every Friday night, and everybody comes, and the bishop has always been coming, even though the bishop believes that the only correct way of baptism is immersion. Let's say you have to be dunked to be baptized, right? But at the barbecue, every Friday night, when people come from all over, you've got people who've been poured, and you've got people who've been sprinkled. Some were baptized as infants, somewhat. And he's like, oh, I see that God's working in all these lives, and I'm not so sure that immersion is the only baptism way anymore, right? But when the other people come from whatever, the high office, who are like, baptism by immersion is the only way, and you know I'm just making something up, but you know, baptism by immersion is the only way, and you can't eat with people who don't see it that way, right? You can't associate with people who don't see it that way. Then he's like, you know what, I think this Friday I'm not coming to the barbecue, right? Because it's just going to be easier for me, instead of really saying to these people who are coming from out of town, I sit there with these people every week, and I worship with them, and I'm serving with them, and I think it might not matter as much as we thought it mattered. Instead of saying that, he's just like, I think this week I got the sniffles and I'm not going to share in the bar, whatever, you know. And that's Paul's issue with Peter, is he's like, you know what's happening here, and you know this is okay, but you don't want to either stand up to them or make them mad or whatever, and so you're and so you're backing down. The word hypocrisy does fit. Yeah, absolutely, Kathy. Yeah, it does fit. So, and then and he also is pretty hot about the fact that Barnabas has been brought into this. I can't remember what word he uses, but even Barnabas at some point was doing the same thing. Carried away. Yes. Yeah. So, again, you know, Peter should have known better. I don't disagree with that. Peter probably did know better. I mean, you know, he knew Jesus well, and he was, you know, Peter is called the rock, and he's called the rock for a reason, because he is a foundational person in the church. That doesn't go away. And so, I want you to hear the warning in it, but I also want you to hear the encouragement in it, in that, like, God didn't stop using him. God didn't kick him out. God didn't, abandon him or something. Like, Peter was a force in his own right. That's one of the reasons Paul was so upset. He's like, they're watching what you do. So Paul says, who are we trying to please, God or man? I can't, what he said, I think in chapter 1. And the reality is that we struggle with that. We do. We struggle with that in our own calling, in our own witness. And there are times that all of us are, myself included, all of us are going to choose man. And oftentimes it won't be the barbecue on Friday night with the sprinkled baptism people. It will be an internal issue that no one will see. But we will know. We will know that we didn't either by omission or commission, right? That's either we will do something that we weren't supposed to do, but just as often, or maybe more often, it will be a sin of omission in that I'm actually not going to step out and try to do that because I don't want to make people XYZ, whatever. Yeah. So 2 comments, Donna Lynn. Yeah, go ahead.
With talking about Peter like we are, and basically, even though he was the rock, he was an imperfect rock.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
But yet, that's very encouraging.
Absolutely.
Because if Christ, God can work with Peter,
right,
I'm sure he can handle me.
Right. Absolutely. Yep. And I think the more we know about the position that Peter was in, I think the more that we can have a tender heart towards him and be like, you know what, that's hard stuff that he was up against. So.
Also, you got to remember, he was a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee.
Yes.
That's all, his family had been that from the beginning of time, and that's all he saw as his future, and his children's futures and his children's children's, in an unbroken line. Now suddenly, he's taken out of that, and he's, a lot of this stuff he may not know how to deal with.
I remember one of the things when we studied in Acts when Peter and John, I think they were doing miracles. Peter did a miracle outside the temple. Somebody remembers that? And they were pulled in front of the Jewish leaders saying, stop that, whatever. And Peter had to speak there. And we were talking about the difference between these educated men of reputation and Peter's just an average Joe. And we talked about just how intimidating that would be. Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
And that's the distinction between he and Paul.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Because what does Paul say I am? I was the Pharisee of the Pharisee. I was the best of the best. I remember last week, I'm like, I woke up happy with myself and I went to bed that way too, and so, he had the credentials differently, sure, which does matter. But which is so interesting because it's almost like what an even more dramatic transformation in some ways, because Paul was all in on the other side, if you will. Yeah. Barb, did you still have something that you wanted to share?
It's a regression kind of, but remember in Acts when Barnabas stopped traveling with Paul, and we kind of tried to grasp
over the John Mark issue? When John Mark,
But I find this very interesting, that this says, the defection of Barnabas in this situation was of a far more serious nature with regard to Gentile freedom than. I'm at the wrong place. Okay.
It's okay.
It is not impossible that this incident, by producing a temporary feeling of distrust with Paul, may have prepared the way for the dissension between Paul and Barnabas, which shortly afterward led to their separation.
Interesting.
I just found that very interesting because we talked about that when we studied Acts, about what happened there.
Yes. I think, and I don't know this, but I think Paul was a man who, if you fail me, I'm done with you. I don't know, I think there's a little bit of that.
I don't know that
he was very passionate, yes, and so I don't know that to be true because but in a different way, because John Mark wanted to go back and he didn't stay, and then Barnabas went with him. Barnabas and John Mark were cousins. But then later he says, "Bring John Mark." So it wasn't forever. He did soften back to him. I can't quote where those things are, but in a different letter, after that happened, seems to be some reconciliation there also. But yeah,
I just found it interesting that they were kind of maybe. This may be why this happened.
Well, relationships do not. I'm going to let Laura talk. The relationships don't sever. Usually, instantaneously.
Yes.
Usually there's a couple of things that lead to some mistrust, and then
there's the
something
strawberry
else
seed.
happens, and you're like, I think this is all we can do right now. Go ahead, Laura.
I just was reminded, the more, this is really causing me to think a lot about Paul and his background and the change in him, and it just reminded me of how through the Bible God picks these unlikely people.
Unlikelies.
You know, just the,
Yes.
how
Over.
much easier in some ways would it have, well, I don't know, before I say that, I started to say how much easier would it have been for Paul to go to the Jews. But that's not where God sends him to.
Right.
And there were very good reasons for that, I'm sure.
Yes.
But it's just the unlikely people that God chose to.
Alex and I talked about that as he was preparing his message for Sunday, because he talked about fear in his message, and we talked about the message, the story of the man with the withered hand, and that's just a favorite of mine. It's all three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the story is where the Pharisees are really trying to catch Jesus, or because he's healing on the Sabbath, like that's like the issue. But there's this man with a withered hand, and Jesus is going to heal him. But like a withered hand, a broken hand, a disabled hand would have been like something probably to be ashamed of, or something to try to hide, or something that was like a disability, something that was seen as a negative, right? And Jesus says to the man, stretch out your hand. And to me that's so symbolic, because I think it's often the things that what we see as our weakest links are the things that Jesus wants to use and heal, because that's where he will. I said not long ago in something I was saying, it's often the darkest parts of our story where Jesus says, I can use that. Like that's actually that part that you wish you could just put away and forget or hide or whatever. That's actually the part that I want to shine my light on, because that's the source of the greatest transformation in your life, which is one of the reasons that, like, after 25 years of not talking about it, I started talking about the abuse in my background, and it's hard for me still to talk about that but it helps people. I watch that it helps people. When somebody early on, when I was beginning to just play with sharing it, where I was like, I'm a mess, I can't share this. A good friend said to me, like, people will listen to that and say, if that's happened to her and she can share it, then maybe I don't have to hide it or be ashamed of it anymore either. And that really broke something open for me to be able to just feel God's not just permission, but blessing to say, I know this part of your life is dark, and I know that you're ashamed of it, and I know you've tried to hide it for years, but God, right? But I actually, because we've worked on it so much, and because you've had some healing to it, I would really love to shine the spotlight on that and say, God has done this, and but what does he say? You got to stretch out your hand, right? You got to stretch out. Yeah. So all that to say, yes, Laura, I think it's absolutely sometimes the things that we say we'll never do or whatever, are the very places that God grows us enough that then that's exactly sometimes what we're doing. Yeah. So, good observation. Absolutely. Let's see. So Paul's talking about hypocrisy, and one of the questions that I thought, how can we prevent hypocrisy? In Galatians 2:6, there's one way there, I think, is to know that God makes no distinction. He's not partial to one group over the other. Even the group that bullies, or the group that has the louder voices. In chapter 1, verse 10, that's where Paul says, I'm not fearing or seeking to please men, but Christ. We can avoid hypocrisy by actually fearing in reverence, God, not men. This is hard. This is hard. Go back into chapter 2, in verses 15 to 21, Paul is making a case for justification by faith. We talked about justification a couple weeks ago, but we looked it up, I think, this week, page 45. Wondered what kind of observations you all had when you looked up, if you got that far, on 45, what justified means. 45, number 3, about a third of the way down. What'd you find?
Being declared righteous.
Being declared righteous.
That was one of the things.
Yep.
To render just or innocent.
Yes. To render as innocent.
Not guilty.
To be declared not guilty.
Free.
To be free. Yep. if you remember when we talked about grace a couple of weeks ago now, and I put this up here, we talked about, I'll put it back up here, that there are these three like manifestations of grace, purposes of grace, and justifying is what I call the gap closing grace. And one of the ways that I think about the gap closing grace is like it's what makes us able to be in relationship with God, because our sinful nature doesn't prevent the indwelling of the Holy Spirit in us. So he overlooks the sin, if you will, and still dwells within us, even though we are, as we're human and as we are on earth, a sinful creature. But it also is true in calling, like what we were just talking about, stretch out your hand. Like, I will use you in ministry, even though, like, your sin doesn't nullify your message. Your sin doesn't nullify my desire to use you in ministry. How many of us, for whatever reason, have decided at one point or another that we thought we were hearing God call us to do something, but we couldn't be right about that because God wouldn't use someone who X, Y, Z, right? That God wouldn't use me with this in my life, or that if other people knew that I had this in my life, they would know that I was a hypocrite and shouldn't be used, right? But the justifying grace in our life is God looking down on us saying, I know who you are and where you've been and what you've done, and I still have a calling on your life. I still have work for you, kingdom work for you to do. That doesn't get in the way. Go ahead, Sherry. Yeah.
My sister goes to a Methodist church in Graceville, Illinois, and it's like 100 people. And they have a lady pastor now named Karen, and when she started, she said, we happened to be there just visiting, and she said, I've been married and divorced this many times, and I had an addiction problem. She named like 4 or 5 things that she did. She says, I'm telling you this because someone's going to tell you about this. And she says, but from the time she was little, she wanted to be a nun. They weren't even Catholic. She had,
That's interesting.
doesn't that tell you something? She thought she knew what a nun was, you know,
Yeah.
and I want to be that. She had that heart for God as a kid.
As a kid, yeah. And what a windy road it's been to get to her to where she's been, obviously. Yeah. I told you guys last week, that not this past week, the week before, I was working at a retreat for teenage girls, and a couple of them were sharing some personal story about some things that in their past. And I've said this before, you've heard me say this, but I'm such a firm believer that shame loses its grip when it's brought to the light. So when we, even if you don't like share in a large, if you can begin to talk about whatever it is with a spouse, with a trusted friend, with not everybody's the right person, right? But when you speak it out loud and the world doesn't crack open and swallow you all up and and all this stuff, it begins to lose its hold, because the enemy will tell you no one has ever done anything that bad. You can never, because of what you've done or whatever, fill in the blank. And when we begin to share that in a place where someone can hold our stories, it will begin to loosen its grip. And even sometimes just speaking it out loud, if it's very painful for us, speaking it out loud when you're alone, and claiming the promises of God over whatever it is, and saying it out loud can actually be very freeing. It's a beautiful first step. God wants us to be free. He wants us to trust in this justifying grace that covers, because it does cover.
I don't even know, it was in some kind of devotion or something about the grace of God, that you need to realize there's nothing you can do to make God love you more. And nothing that you've done will cause him to love you less.
Which is this
that
grace.
He still
Yes,
loves you.
absolutely.
It's just grace.
And when you know that, and Paul knew that, and the Galatian church had received it, and then when someone comes behind you and says, no, actually there are things you have to do, and here's the book and the rules you have to follow, and the people are like, oh, okay, then you can begin to understand why he was like, he was so intense about trying to be like, no, this is ridiculous. Yeah. So I'm looking at time. We're about through it, and let's see, page 45, number 4. We looked up something in just below where we were. What did we learn about justified in Romans? Anybody get that far? What did we learn there?
You're righteous by observing the law.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the law can't
Make it
save
law
us
makes
from
you
sin
conscious of sin.
and the
Yes.
penalty it deserves. Actually.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was mentioning last
Yeah.
week, which we're going to talk about more maybe next week or the following week, where the law can point us to our error, but it can't save us from our error, right? And I think there's a, there's a
Same way with
place.
our works.
Yes.
We cannot be saved
Yeah.
by works.
Right, yeah. The works should be, remember the apple tree that I talked about a couple weeks ago? The work should be the non-straining, just fruit of this internal connection with Jesus, and so then we're just fruitful in the world. But it shouldn't be like, okay, well, I've got to do 2 things today, that way I can check those off and then I can be right with God. It just doesn't work that way. Yeah, it won't ever work that way.
It's kind of like you're trying to put the fruit on the tree.
Right, yes. Okay, there's no apples on this tree, but I'll like make one and put it here, It's like, okay, well, it didn't create it. It's just kind of trying to hold it, but the duct tape isn't holding or whatever, yeah. So go ahead, Barb.
In New Living, there was, and this was, I believe in Romans, but it says the more we know about God's law, the clearer it becomes that they weren't obeying it. We aren't obeying it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like you can't obey all of it.
Well,
It's
and
just impossible.
this is true for that law and for any church that's like
Exactly.
you can't regulate a heart issue. Like you can't, and that's what we said this, I think last week, where the desire so often is to go to something so that we can measure. We got to find something measurable. That's why we go to works, and that's why we go to law, because if we can measure it, then we're okay. And the reality is, you measure a right relationship with God by the blessing that you are in the world. But that's not but you can't put that in like a, well, it's half cup. It doesn't work like that. It's intangible. You can see it. I mean, it's not intangible that you can't see it or feel it, but you can't measure it the same way, You can't check the box.
No.
I was a blessing today. Like most of the time, I think a lot of times you're a blessing, and a lot of times you don't even know it. You're right, yeah. Today, not so much. Yeah. So, but I think a lot of times you're a blessing and you don't know it.
You know when you're doing it.
Yeah.
You know it. You feel that nudge.
Yeah.
You do it anyway.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, nobody here does, but yeah, right.
I
know.
And I know it.
Yeah.
I can list it on a
Yeah,
sheet.
yeah.
I know exactly
Yeah.
when I did it
Mhm.
and what I did.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You talk
Yeah.
about your
Yeah.
friend
Yes.
that went to your,
Yes.
Well,
your
Paul
sermon.
Yes.
You know.
And I'm so excited about precepts.
Yes.
And in 2 of my Bible studies from our church, I don't want to say I made the mistake. I
Yes.
just plowed right through and said, I'm in this precept.
Yeah.
Some of the people were saying, well, who's teaching? I said, Angie, she's a pastor, blah, blah, blah. And everyone was like,
You're learning from a girl.
I did it
Yeah.
twice.
Yeah. Before you figured out they don't want. Yeah.
No,
I know.
yeah.
Yeah, I
But,
know.
I come
Yep.
from up north,
I know.
and then, like I say, I know women pastors. And
Right.
I just forget that now I'm down here and I'm a Baptist.
Yes.
And-
Yes.
They're very
Yes.
anti, of course, the Catholic Church.
Yes, I know.
No,
I know.
But I have
Yeah.
never thought that
Yeah.
was right.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
it never.
Well,
It's just the
you
way
think
they
about
set it
that.
up.
I mean, think about Sherry. I'm going to use you an example
Yeah.
for just a second. We'll go back to the Paul Peter thing.
Yeah.
So if your people at your church were like, Sherry,
Yeah.
you can't learn from a
Yeah,
woman.
yeah.
And after you've been in this class
Yeah.
and you learn, and you know,
Yeah.
and if you decided, I mean, like if you don't come,
I'd
we're going to
be-
know that you
I'd
decided.
be
But no,
very-
but I'm just like, seriously, that's an obstacle that we
Yeah.
face sometimes. This is a real example of what we were just talking about, where she has to decide, where we have to decide. Totally lost control. She has to decide, am I going to respond to the movement of God that I see and feel, or am I going to respond to any pressure, any pressure that I might feel because this doesn't meet the rules of my denomination. I'm going to circle back and see what, Joyce is saying, great discussion. So a couple of things I'm going to go through and finish this chapter, and then if there's time for a comment, we'll take one more. How did Paul describe his new life in Christ? I know you guys have already put your stuff away. 19, he was living with God, living to God,
Living to
and
God.
20, he was crucified with Christ, right?
He lives in the flesh, but
Uh-huh.
by faith in
Right.
God.
Yes, which is all. That is our goal. That's supposed to be our goal, to live to God and work to please men. And I encourage you to just kind of work to please God, not men. Yeah, no. Andy's, I'm teaching everything. Oh no. And verse 21, I want to unpack 21 just for a second. What does verse 21 mean?
Well, because God died as a one-time sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just went back to following the law and rules, he died for nothing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's kind of like so insulting too when you think about this. You know, he died on the cross for our punishment. The punishment, for our sins. And he took the punishment that we really deserved.
Yeah.
And basically we're saying, okay, your work on the cross wasn't good enough unless you are circumcised and eat kosher food.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what they were saying.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds so, but it's so insulting to Christ when you think about their belief in the law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Does
And
that make
ours.
sense?
And ours. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
But also the law for the Jews was bred into the bone. It was in every fabric
Well,
of their day.
It's not because, how important or significant or difficult was the change for Peter if under that pressure and, internal pressure, the pressure that we feel sometimes to conform to what people around us say is the right way to relate to God is our internal pressure as much as anything else. And it was just radical for Peter to be eating with those people. And then when, push came to shove, at least at this one example that we have in Scripture, he didn't do it, right? So the message, the last sentence says it this way. I want to close down on this and I'm going to pray for you. If a living relationship with God, a living relationship, that's different than going to church, all right? Not going to church. If a living relationship with God could come by rule keeping, then Christ died unnecessarily.
Yeah.
And Paul is like, and I don't want nothing to do with that. Yeah. If a living relationship, we're not talking about being church members. We're talking about being Jesus followers. A living relationship with God. So, hey, we're done 3 minutes early. I don't know what's up with that, but good discussion today. I know, I'll have to bring some more material for next week. Good discussion today. Good work today. I don't think I have any other announcements. I'm going to pray for you guys and then let you go. Father, we thank you for this time of study and just this deep dive into Galatians 2, and thank you for what you're teaching us. And it's so rich to hear the people bringing their different thoughts from where you've taken them this week in different commentaries and different thoughts and different experiences from their own lives. Just so grateful for all of it to just be shared, or some of it at least to be shared and lifted up in this time of study. So I just ask that you help us this week to make time with you a priority. Maybe some of that in Precept, maybe not all of it in Precept, Lord, because there's a lot of different ways that you speak to us, God. But please help us to continue to want to spend time with you, and to remember, Lord, that the way that we make apples, if you will, is by staying connected to the source that will actually provide the nutrients, the air, everything that we need in order for those apples to be able to come from us, Lord. And so help us to make you our number one priority, and thank you. Thank you for your justifying grace, Lord, which comes into all of our lives, which is present in all of our lives, and say, yeah, that may not have been the best choice, the best decision, whatever, but it doesn't nullify what I've done for you. I have loved you. I do love you. I am yours and you are mine. Thank you so much for that reminder this morning, Lord, and we just lift all this in thanksgiving and praise, Lord, in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, and goodbye to our online friends.